In the history of Major League Baseball, there have been 4 instances where a team won 20 games or more in a row, from the 1916 Giants to the 2017 Indians. So let's look at these 4 streaks and what was the best.
Totally sports-esque. Major League.
There are 3 other 20-plus game win streaks that occurred in the 1800s before the merger. The 1884 Providence Grays and St. Louis Maroons winning 20 straight in the same year, the Grays winning the National League and the Maroons winning the Union Association. And 4 years before that, the Chicago White Stockings went on a 21-game win streak, the team later changing their name to the Cubs and going on the same streak 55 years later. There's also the Independent League Salt Lake City Trappers, who went on a 29-game win streak in 1987, which I made a video about, but we'll just be looking at these 4. We'll start with the 1 and 4th and most famous one in the 2002 Oakland A's 20-game win streak, that being the most famous because of the 2011 movie Spy Kids 4, which had trailers of the 2011 movie Moneyball. And like 3 of these streaks, the A's were not in first place at the start of their streak. On August 13th, they were 4.5 games out of first, and that day, they would beat the Blue Jays 5-4. Barry Zito picking up the win, Billy Koch picking up the save, and Chris Carpenter picking up the loss. They would win another over Toronto the next day, and for the next 3 weeks, they would only play teams from the AL Central, a division that outside of the Twins was not that great, with the Twins being the only team to finish above 500. But that doesn't guarantee anything. They won the first game over an AL Central team, the White Sox, 1-0, and that would be the last 1-run game for a while, winning 13 of the next 14 by 3 runs or more, with those last 3 coming down to the wire. Win number 18 came with a 3-run walk-off home run from future MVP Miguel Tejada, and the next night, he again walked it off with a single, which tied the 1906 White Sox and the 1947 Yankees for the American League record with 19 wins. And the next night, they almost made history in a different way, blowing an 11-run lead after innings of sloppy play, looking at a terrible end to an incredible streak. But then, like something out of a movie, Scott Hattiesburg would hit a walk-off home run for the A's to reach number 20, which at the time, no games, their opponents had an average record of 74-88, and on average they won those games by 3.9 runs. And looking further at those teams, they had an average offensive WAR of 13.6. For reference, this year's Oakland A's had an offensive WAR of 13.8, and the average wins above average of these teams was negative 8.12. A third of teams this year having a negative wins above average, with the Pirates negative 8.3 the closest in this regard. And going into these games, starting pitchers going against the A's had an average ERA of 5.2. Obviously not the most impressive stats, with these teams coming from what was the weakest division. But again, it doesn't matter about the competition, as there's a reason no other American League team had done it before. And how does it compare to the other 3 streaks? The streak in 3rd and 2nd in the National League since it happened is the 1935 Cubs. This was before they were officially cursed, but this was their best season since their dominance at the end of the 1900s. Obviously, the league was different back then with 16 teams in total, with the top team in the National League and American League meeting in the World Series. And on September 4th, 1935, the Cubs were 2.5 games behind the Cardinals. And after a win that day over the Phillies, they wouldn't be in second for long. Basically the opposite of the A streak, their tight games were in the beginning. Their second win coming in 11 innings with a Frank DeMari single. And the next day, they would beat the Phillies in 10 innings with an Augie Gallen walk-off home run. And they took off from there. 11 of the next 13 were decided by 3 runs or more. What really carried them was their pitching. In all but 1 game in the streak, they gave up less than 3 runs. And that 1 game was a wild one, in which they beat the Brooklyn Dodgers 18-14. And with that 11 straight win, they had outscored opponents 79-29 in that time frame, with almost half the runs they gave up coming in that game. And with that win, they took the lead in the pennant race over the defending champion Cardinals, and they never lost it. Starting the streak against weaker teams, they finished the streak by beating the teams that finished 5th, 4th, 3rd, and 2nd. Those last 2 wins being over the Cardinals, with the pennant already clinched. They would lose in extra innings the next day, and in their final game of the season, they would drop a game against the Cardinals. But that 21-game win streak was the reason they won the pennant. But in the World Series, they would lose in 6 games to the Tigers, the team they beat in 1907 and 1908, but in their 5th try, the Tigers got their first World Series title. This being the last time the Cubs won 100 games until 2016, and they won exactly 100. So without that streak, there's no pennant, and the 100-win season drought will go back to 1910. And over that streak, their opponents had an average record of 74-79-2. Ties being a thing at the time, though there were no ties during the streak. They won these games by an average of 4.1 runs, with the teams having an average offensive WAR of 15.9, and a wins above average of -2. Those numbers getting better as the streak went on, with better competition. And the average starter they faced had an ERA of 4.48. Considering the stakes in the competition, this streak was very impressive, and well remembered amongst Cubs fans, though the ending in the World Series did not go as hoped, with their next closest 100-win season being in 1945 with 98 wins. With the exact same ending in the World Series, that's all curse placed on them by a GOAT. and the one following them, and the current kings of American League streaks, is the 2017 Cleveland Indians. Unlike the A's and the Cubs, they were leading their division when the streak started, as after beating the Red Sox 13-6 on August 24th, they were 5.5 games up, and they would win their last 7 of the month, with just one game being decided by less than 4 runs. Then they would win 8 in a row over the bottom teams in the division, and the Tigers and the White Sox, before heading to Baltimore, who would finish last in their division, and they would sweep them. To that point, they gave up 2 runs or less in 14 of the 18 wins, with 5 of those being shutouts. And that would go to 7 after they would shut out the Tigers in their next 2 games, to give the 2002 A's company at the top with their 20th straight win. And the next day, they would pick up win number 21 over the Tigers to officially give them the longest winning streak in American League history, and allow people watching Moneyball to point out the real facts. And they wanted to extend that lead and move into second all-time, and this was the dramatic game that every streak needs. The Royals took a 1-run lead in the 6th and held it going to the 9th. And with 2 outs and 1 on, their chances to win were down to 11%. Then in their version of the Scott Hattiesburg home run, Francisco Lindor had drive to left that was just out of the reach of Alex Gordon, and Tyler Naquin would come all the way around to score and tie the game. Then in the 10th, Jose Ramirez started things with a double, followed by an Edwin Encarnacion walk. Then Jay Bruce would hit a walk-off double to officially pass the 1935 Cubs, and keep the streak alive with just the 1916 Giants in their sight. But the magic ran out the next night, as they would lose by 1 to the Royals, as the current AL record stands at 22 straight wins. Their division lead grew to 13.5, and by the end of the season, they held a 17-game lead, with 102 wins, which was their first time winning 100 games since 1954, when they would win the pennant. And there was no repeat of it, as after taking a 2-0 lead over the Yankees in the ALDS, they would lose the final 3 games, with 2 straight years of losing the final 3 games of a series. With most of their opponents coming within their own division, their opponents had an average record of 78-85, having an average offensive WAR of 16.4, and wins above average of -2.4, while the average starter they faced had a pretty high ERA of 5.32. But what is most impressive is the 4.8 average runs per game they won by. More impressive by saying that they outscored their opponents 142-37, trailing in just 8 of the 199 innings in the time. A stretch of dominance that, just like the 2002 A's, was the difference in the division, though there was a bigger gap here, and just like the 2002 A's, it ended with an ALDS loss. And then that leaves the longest win streak in MLB history, including everything before 1903, that belonging to the 1916 New York Giants. This was truly one of the weirdest teams of all time, as back in May of that year, they won 17 games in a row, which was 1 away from the National League record at the time, set by the 1904 New York Giants. But they were inconsistent, losing 13-16 at the end of August, including being shut out 3 times by the Cardinals, which was the only time in franchise history they were shut out 3 times in a 3-game series. And they were 15 games out of the pennant race at that point. And it would go down to 14 the next day, when the streak would begin on September 7th against the Brooklyn Robins. And just like every win streak needs, their pitching really stepped up, with half of their first 12 wins seeing them giving up 1 run or less. And it was after the 12th win that came the controversy, as in the second game of a doubleheader, they would tie 1-1 in an 8-inning game. But according to the rules, a tie does not end a win streak, and if it did, the 2017 Indians would have the longest streak. But they don't, as the Giants kept rolling. They tied themselves to the win over the Cubs for number 17. Then the next night, they would beat the Cardinals to tie the NL record at 18. And later that day, in a 7-inning game, they won number 19 for the NL record, tying the 1906 White Sox for the all-time record. And the next day, they took the first of a doubleheader in a 1-0 game to officially set the record, becoming the first MLB team to win 20 straight games. And they wouldn't let up, deciding to win an additional 6 in a row. But in their final game of the doubleheader and their final game of September, they lost to the Boston Braves to end the win streak at 26, a record that still stands, with their final 14 wins seeing them give up 2 runs or less, with 10 of their 26 wins being shutouts. And in the end, the streak didn't really matter, as though they cut the deficit down to 5 after being at 15, they would finish 7 games out of first, which would end their season. Without context, you would assume the 1916 Giants were one of the most dominant teams ever, with 2 win streaks in the top 10 of all time, including the one at the very top. But those middle months hurt, and not one of their pitchers won 20 games in a time where pitchers pitched a lot. And during the historic streak, their opponents had an average record of 75, 78, and 2. Again, there being ties, including that one in their streak, also having a run differential of 3.15. Their opponents having an offensive WAR of 17.03, a wins above average of -0.87, and their opposing starters having an ERA of 2.72. Should we mention that this was the dead ball era, with less runs being scored, but still very impressive. Ultimately, these streaks have some similarities, each one ending in September, and all but the 1916 Giants propelling them to the playoffs. But ultimately, the 1916 Giants won as many playoff series as the other 3 teams. Maybe the longest winning streaks being a curse is just 4 of the 20 teams in MLB history to win 16+ games in a row, going on to win the World Series, and 9 even making the World Series, with none of the 5 teams since the 1953 Yankees even winning a playoff series, though it ultimately is about getting hot at the right time. And looking at the 4 20-plus game win streaks, it was the 2017 Indians who led in 2 of these categories, and their 4.8 run differential per game by far being the best. But in those other 3, it was the 1916 Giants in the lead, the opponent ERA being the best by a good margin, with opponent WAR and wins above average also being the best. And part of that could be just 16 teams being the league, and without interleague play until the World Series, there are only 7 teams the 1916 Giants and 1935 Cubs will play, with the 1935 Cubs only playing 6 of those teams during their streak, that other team being the Reds, who finished 16 games under 500. But in my opinion, the most impressive win streak belongs to the 2017 Indians. It's hard to compare streaks many decades apart, but what separates them from the 2002 A's is the competition and the overall dominance. Though both teams faced starters with high ERAs, almost every team the A's faced being from the worst division in baseball that year did not help. Granted, the Indians faced the bottom of the AL Central in their own streak, but they also beat 2 playoff teams along the way, and they completely dominated. Going back to that 105 run differential, not only was it the best over a 22-game span in franchise history, it was the best over any 22-game span since the 1939 Yankees. Their starters going 19-0 with a 1.77 ERA, while their bullpen had a 1.17 ERA. Their offense hitting more home runs than their starters allowed in runs, and they put these games away early. They would outscore their opponents 69-14 in the first 3 innings of games. Ultimately, the most impressive streak, and that tie in the middle of the 1916 Giant streak, takes a little bit away from it, and you can ultimately look at the 2017 Indians as having the real longest win streak. And you can also look at the 1935 Cubs streak as being more impressive than the 1916 Giants. The Cubs were in a situation where they had to win nearly every game to win the pennant, and well, they did. The Cubs were 2.5 out to start the streak, and the Cardinals finished the month going 17-9, including ending the year with 2 wins over the Cubs. But the Cubs finished the year going 21-2, with all those wins being in a row. Though the Giants' competition was a little better, the streak that led to a pennant with no ties puts it ahead. And no matter the competition or the era, the streaks are very impressive, there being a reason only 4 teams have done so since 1903, with some of the greatest teams of all time never going on a streak close to these, though not one of them ended up winning a World Series. But still, they are remembered for a time frame, just like the 2024 White Sox, who heroically went on a 1-game win streak on August 6 to prevent them from passing the 1961 Phillies as the kings of the losing streaks. Hopefully you liked this video, and if so, please consider liking and subscribing for new videos every week. Thank you.